London, January, 1943. The dawn breaks over a city that is tired, bone tired. The fog rolling off the Thames isn't just cold, it carries the grit of bomb dust and the smell of coal smoke. But the people standing on the street corners aren't looking up at the sky for German bombers anymore. They are looking at the shuttered windows of the local grocer. They are waiting, standing in line, clutching small, tattered ration books as if they were religious texts. Inside those books are coupons for 2 ounces of butter a week, 4 ounces of bacon, 1 solitary fresh egg, if you are lucky. This is life on the edge of survival. Every family in Britain knows the gnawing feeling of a stomach that is never quite full. But what they don't see, as they stand in the damp morning air, is the invisible thread that connects that empty shop window to a frozen port 3,000 miles away. Stop for a moment. Look at the loaf of dark, coarse bread in the baker's hand. Look at the tin of powdered milk on the shelf. Look at the fuel in the tank of the ambulance passing by. None of this belongs here. None of it was made here. Britain is an island. A fortress, yes, but a fortress that cannot feed itself. Before the war, 50 million people lived here, and nearly 70% of their food came from overseas. By 1943, with the war consuming every resource, that dependency has climbed to over 90%. Britain is a patient on life support, and the breathing tube stretches all the way across the wildest, darkest ocean on Earth, the North Atlantic. Every calorie that keeps a London child alive, every gallon of aviation fuel that keeps a Spitfire in the air, and every shell casing fired by the British Army has to travel through the most dangerous stretch of water in history. Now, I want you to try a terrifying experiment. Close your eyes. Picture the map of the Atlantic. Picture the hundreds of merchant ships gathering in the great harbors of Halifax and St. John's, Newfoundland. Now, wipe them away. Imagine the Canadian convoys simply vanish. Imagine there are no corvettes bouncing like corks in the rough seas, flying the red ensign or the maple leaf. Imagine there are no Canadian pilots patrolling the endless gray skies above the shipping lanes, hunting for the periscopes that break the surface. If you remove Canada from this picture, the silence you hear is deafening. Without those ships, the lifeline is cut. Not frayed, cut. The German U-boats, the gray wolves of Admiral Donitz, are not just hunting ships. They are hunting the very breath of this island. Their goal isn't just to sink destroyers. It is to ensure that the woman standing in line in London goes home to an empty table. Their weapon is not just the torpedo. It is starvation. A British housewife wrote in her diary during the darkest days of the blockade, "We are so hungry. It's not a sharp pain anymore, just a dull ache that makes you want to sleep and never wake up." They say ships are coming, but the sea is full of graves. That sea is indeed full of graves. But in the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic, before the sun even rises, there is a shield holding back the total collapse of the Allied war effort. It is a shield forged in shipyards from Montreal to Vancouver, and manned by prairie boys who had never seen the ocean before they signed up. This shield has a name: the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force. We often hear that Britain stood alone, but that is a myth. Britain stood because Canada stood with her on the waves. But what if we took that away? What if Canada had stayed a small, passive colony? What if those Canadian corvettes never sailed, and those bombers never flew? This is not just a story about battleships and strategy. This is a story about the difference between a Britain that fights on and a Britain that starves into surrender. This is the story of how close the world really came to darkness. To understand the magnitude of the disaster that almost happened, we have to look back at who stood on the other side of the ocean before the first shot was fired. September 1939. If you looked at Canada then, you would not see a superpower. You would see a nation of farmers, loggers, and miners still dusting off the poverty of the Great Depression. You would see a country whose military ambitions seemed to end at its own borders. The Royal Canadian Navy, the force that would eventually hold the fate of Britain in its hands, was, to put it bluntly, tiny. On the day war was declared, the RCN had exactly 6 destroyers. 6. And a handful of minesweepers. That was it. A navy you could practically count on your fingers. It had fewer than 2,000 sailors. The Royal Canadian Air Force was in a similar state, a flying club with obsolete planes and a spirit that far outstripped its equipment. When Britain declared war on Germany, the world held its breath. The mighty Royal Navy was stretched thin across the globe, protecting an empire on which the sun never set. But the Atlantic? The Atlantic was a cold, dark back door that was suddenly kicked wide open. And then, something extraordinary happened. 7 days after Britain entered the war, Canada followed. It was the first time Canada declared war as an independent nation. But a declaration is just paper. What followed was an industrial and human miracle that defies logic even today. The call went out from London. We need ships. We need planes. We need men. Canada didn't just answer the call. It transformed its entire existence to meet it. Shipyards that had been silent for years suddenly erupted with the flash of welding torches. Factories that made washing machines and cars were gutted and retooled to churn out munitions and aircraft parts. From the grain elevators of the prairies to the fishing villages of the Maritimes, a sleeping giant was waking up. The RCN began an expansion that is unparalleled in naval history. It exploded from that tiny cluster of 6 destroyers into the 3rd largest navy in the world by the end of the war. Think about that for a second. From 6 ships to nearly 400 fighting vessels. They built a fleet from scratch. They built the Flower-class corvettes, small, bobbing ships that, as one sailor put it, would roll on wet grass. These weren't majestic battleships. They were whalers modified for war, crammed with depth charges, and young men who had often never seen the sea. But they were built fast. They were built in numbers, and they were the only thing standing between a U-boat torpedo and a merchant ship. Simultaneously, the skies over Canada were filling with the roar of engines. Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the Allied leaders initiated the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. They turned the vast, open spaces of Canada into what President Roosevelt called the aerodrome of democracy. Pilots from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway flocked to Canadian air bases. Over 130,000 aircrew were trained here. If you were a pilot defending the skies of London or bombing the factories of the Ruhr, chances are you learned to fly over the wheat fields of Manitoba or the foothills of Alberta. But why Canada? Why was this specific contribution the linchpin? It comes down to the cruel geography of war. Look at the map. The Atlantic Ocean is a bridge. On one side is the arsenal of North America, the factories of Detroit, the steel of Pittsburgh, the grain of Saskatchewan. On the other side is the fortress of Britain, hungry and besieged. Canada is the on-ramp to that bridge. The ports of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and St. John's, Newfoundland, became the most important cities in the Allied world. They were the funnels. Every tank, every soldier, every crate of powdered eggs had to pass through them. The Royal Canadian Navy took on a specific, terrifying responsibility: the Mid-Atlantic. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy could protect the convoys near their own shores, but there was a massive, lawless gap in the middle of the ocean where air cover couldn't reach and where the U-boats hunted with impunity. Canada stepped into that gap. They took the job that no one else could do simply because they were there and they were willing. So, we have the setup. A mobilized nation, a navy built from sheer willpower, an air force training the world. But now, we must return to our dark experiment. Let's take the eraser of history and wipe it all away. Let's assume Canada stayed neutral. Or let's assume they simply couldn't build the ships fast enough. Let's assume those shipyards in Halifax remained silent, and those airfields in the prairies remained empty. Imagine the convoys setting out from New York or Sydney, heading into the black pit of the Atlantic, alone. Without those Canadian escorts, the equation of the war changes instantly. It stops being a fight for victory and becomes a mathematical countdown to starvation. Because when you remove the shield, the wolves don't just bite, they feast. This was the Battle of the Atlantic. But history books often make it sound like a chess match between admirals. It wasn't. It was a knife fight in a dark alley. And it was, above all else, a battle for the right to eat. To understand why the removal of Canada is fatal, you have to understand the anatomy of a convoy. Picture a box on the ocean. Inside that box are 50 merchant ships, old tankers, rusty freighters, carrying the lifeblood of the Allied cause. Wheat, oil, steel, blood plasma. They are slow, plodding along at the speed of a bicycle, sitting ducks in the vast ocean. Surrounding them is the screen, the sheepdogs protecting the flock. This is where the Royal Canadian Navy lived and died. By the height of the war, Canadian ships provided nearly half of all the escorts on the Atlantic run. The Canadian Flower-class corvettes, ships like the HMCS Agassiz, the Chilliwack, the Oakville, were the workhorses. They were wet, they stank of vomit and diesel, and they were relentlessly uncomfortable. But they were always there. They zigzagged on the flanks, their ASDIC sonar pinging into the deep, creating a wall of noise and depth charges that kept the German U-boats at bay. Now, let's execute our what if. Pull the Canadian Navy out of the water. Instantly, the screen protecting those 50 merchant ships is cut in half. The wall has holes in it, gaping holes. The German tactic was the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. They didn't attack alone. They gathered in groups of 10 or 20, waiting for nightfall. They would surface inside the convoy columns, slashing at the merchant ships like wolves in a sheep pen. Without the Canadian corvettes to chase them down, to force them underwater, or to illuminate the night with star shells, the U-boats would have operated with near total impunity. The result wouldn't just be a defeat, it would be a slaughter. Instead of losing 5 ships in a convoy, you lose 20. Instead of 1 million tons of supplies arriving in Liverpool, you get a shoreline full of wreckage and oil-soaked bodies. The Atlantic becomes a graveyard, and the supply chain simply snaps. And here is where the domino fell. It falls straight onto the dinner plates of the British people. In 1941 and 1942, Britain was importing barely enough to survive. The margin for error was 0. If the tonnage losses had increased by just 10 or 15%, a conservative estimate if you remove the RCN, the entire rationing system collapses. We are not talking about tightening belts. We are talking about the disappearance of essential calories. The Ministry of Food in London had calculated exactly how much a human being needed to keep working in a factory. If the Canadian convoys stop coming, the bread ration is cut. Then the potatoes run out. Then the milk for children dries up. A famine in 1940s Britain seems unthinkable to us now. But without the wheat from the Canadian prairies arriving at the docks in Bristol and Glasgow, it was a mathematical certainty. Imagine the scene in an aircraft factory in Coventry. The workers are fainting at their lathes, not from bombs, but from hunger. Scurvy and rickets, diseases from the Middle Ages, return to the slums of London. A starving population cannot build Spitfires. A starving population cannot clear rubble. The British morale, that legendary stiff upper lip, was fueled by tea and bread. Take that away, and the will to fight dissolves. You don't need to invade a country to defeat it. You just need to make its children cry from hunger for long enough, and the government will have no choice but to sue for peace. But the horror doesn't stop at the civilian doorstep. It extends to the front lines. The British Army, and later the Americans preparing for D-Day, relied on a massive, continuous river of supplies. Consider the war in North Africa. General Montgomery fighting Rommel in the desert. His tanks needed fuel. His artillery needed shells. His men needed water and bully beef. Where did it all come from? It came by sea. If the RCN isn't there to protect those tankers in the Atlantic, the fuel doesn't get to Britain to be transshipped to Africa. The tanks in the desert run dry. The guns fall silent. Without Canadian escorts, the logistical backbone of the Allied Army snaps. There is no build-up for D-Day. How could there be? You cannot assemble an invasion force of 2 million men on an island that can't even feed its own residents. There is no stockpile of ammunition. There are no fleets of trucks. If we remove the RCN, we essentially strand the British Army on their own island, unarmed and starving. The German High Command knew this. Admiral Dönitz famously said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me was the U-boat peril." Churchill agreed. They both knew that the war would be won or lost on the tonnage charts of the Atlantic. By filling the gap in the mid-ocean, by taking on the unglamorous, freezing, terrifying job of shepherding those slow convoys, Canada didn't just help. They prevented the strategic strangulation of the last bastion of freedom in Europe. So, the next time you see a picture of a small, rusty Canadian corvette, don't just see a boat. See a lifeline. See the loaf of bread on a London table. See the fuel in a tank fighting fascism. Because without that boat, the table is empty, and the tank is dead. But the ocean was only half the battle. While the RCN was fighting the wolves below, another Canadian force was fighting to keep the Black Pit from becoming a death sentence from above. And if you think the naval story is terrifying, wait until you see what happens when we ground the Canadian Air Force. If the convoys were the lifeline of Britain, they were also moving through a blind spot. For the first few years of the war, there was a terrifying patch of ocean in the middle of the Atlantic. The sailors called it the Black Pit. It was beyond the range of aircraft flying from Britain and beyond the range of aircraft flying from Newfoundland. In the Black Pit, the U-boats were kings. They could surface in broad daylight to recharge their batteries. They could track the convoys at full speed on the surface, outrunning the escorts, and then strike at will. As long as the Black Pit existed, the tonnage war was a losing battle. This is where the Royal Canadian Air Force changed the course of history. From the frozen runways of Gander, Newfoundland, and bases in Nova Scotia, RCAF Eastern Air Command launched a relentless war against the submarine. They flew Cansos, Hudsons, and eventually the Long-Range Liberators. These missions were grueling. Young Canadian crews flew for 12, 14, sometimes 18 hours straight, staring at the endless gray monotony of the ocean, fighting ice on their wings and exhaustion in their minds. But their impact was decisive. An aircraft didn't even need to sink a U-boat to be effective. Just being there was enough. If a U-boat commander saw a plane, he had to dive. And a submerged U-boat is slow, blind, and useless. It can't keep up with a convoy. The RCAF helped close the Black Pit. They turned the safe zone for Germans into a killing zone. Now, apply our eraser. Ground the RCAF. Without those long-range Canadian patrols, the Black Pit remains wide open. The U-boats continue to operate on the surface, hunting like wolves in a field with no shepherd. The loss rate of merchant ships in the mid-Atlantic skyrockets. Remember the starvation calculations we made earlier? Without the air cover forcing the U-boats down, The convoys don't just suffer heavy losses, they get annihilated. The math of survival tilts irreversibly towards disaster. But the Canadian contribution to the air war wasn't just defensive. It was also about taking the war to the enemy. Thousands of Canadians served in the Royal Air Force, but the RCAF also formed its own squadrons. By the end of the war, the RCAF had 48 squadrons overseas. Consider No. 6 Group of Bomber Command. This was a purely Canadian formation. Night after night, thousands of young Canadians climbed into Halifaxes and Lancasters to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. They struck German industries, synthetic oil plants, and transportation hubs. They forced Germany to keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of anti-aircraft guns back in Germany, instead of sending them to the Eastern Front or to defend the beaches of Normandy. If you remove No. 6 Group, you remove a massive chunk of the pressure on the Nazi war machine. The German industry recovers faster. The flow of supplies to the German army increases. The war drags on. But perhaps the single most catastrophic loss, if Canada vanished, wouldn't be a combat squadron. It would be a school. This is the part of the story that often gets overlooked, but it is arguably the most critical factor in the Allied victory in the air. It was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, BCATP. Early in the war, Britain realized a terrifying truth. They could build planes, but they couldn't build pilots. You cannot train thousands of young men to fly when your own airfields are under constant attack by the Luftwaffe, and your airspace is crowded with dogfights. They needed a safe haven. They needed space. They needed Canada. Canada became, in the words of President Roosevelt, the aerodrome of democracy. Over 130,000 aircrew, pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, gunners, were trained in Canada. They came from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and across the Commonwealth. They learned to fly in the clear, safe skies of the prairies, far from the blackout and the bombs. The scale of this operation was staggering. Hundreds of airfields were built in towns that were barely dots on a map. The yellow training aircraft became a fixture of the Canadian sky. Now, for the final time in this chapter, let's play our dangerous game. Close the flight schools. Imagine Britain trying to train that many pilots on its own, cramped, rainy, and war-torn island. It is physically impossible. Without the BCATP, the Royal Air Force and the Allied air fleets would have faced a critical manpower shortage by 1942 or 1943. You can have all the Spitfires and Lancasters in the world, but if the man in the cockpit is poorly trained because he only had half the flight hours he needed, he is going to die, and the mission will fail. The Luftwaffe was ground down not just by superior machines, but by a relentless wave of well-trained Allied aircrew that never stopped coming. That wave started in Canada. If you cut off that supply of men, the air war over Europe changes. The Allies lose air superiority, and without air superiority, the invasion of Europe, D-Day, becomes a suicide mission. So, when we ask, how would Britain collapse? The answer comes from the sky as much as the sea. Without the RCAF patrolling the Atlantic, the convoys sink. Without the RCAF bombing Germany, the Nazi war machine grows stronger. And without the training schools in Canada, the RAF runs out of pilots. It is a three-pronged failure, a cascade of disasters that leaves Britain exposed, defenseless, and essentially grounded. The wings of the maple leaf weren't just a poetic phrase. They were the very oxygen that allowed the Allied fire to keep burning. But all of this, the starvation, the U-boats, the air war, leads to one final, terrifying question. If Britain falls, or if Britain is simply neutralized, what happens to the rest of the world? What happens to the Americans? What happens to the Russians? In the next part, we will look at the global domino effect. We will see how a collapse in the North Atlantic would have reshaped the entire map of the 20th century. We tend to think of World War II as a series of separate battles: the Eastern Front, the Pacific, the desert. But it was a single interconnected organism, and the beating heart of the Western Allied effort was Great Britain. But a heart cannot beat without blood, and as we have seen, Canada was the blood donor. Now, let's look at the final, terrifying domino. What happens to the rest of the world if Canada fails to keep Britain in the fight? Let's assume the scenario we've built. The RCN is overwhelmed. The convoys stop. Britain, starving and out of fuel, is forced to sign a neutrality armistice with Germany in 1942, or simply becomes a neutralized, powerless island, unable to support a massive army. The moment that happens, the entire strategic map of the war collapses. First, look at the United States. By 1942, America is the arsenal of democracy. They have the tanks, the men, and the money. But they have a geography problem. They are 3,000 miles away from the Nazis. Britain was not just a nation. It was the world's largest unsinkable aircraft carrier. It was the warehouse for the invasion of Europe. It was the barracks for millions of American GIs. Without the Royal Canadian Navy keeping the Atlantic open, and without Britain standing firm, the United States has nowhere to park its war machine. You cannot launch D-Day from New York. You cannot fly a B-17 bomber from Boston to Berlin and back. Without Britain as a staging ground, the American liberation of Western Europe becomes a logistical impossibility. The vast U.S. Army remains stranded on the wrong side of the Atlantic, powerless to break Hitler's grip on Paris, Amsterdam, or Brussels. The Second Front evaporates before it is even planned. Now, look east. Look at the Soviet Union. In 1942 and 1943, the Red Army is locked in a death struggle with the Wehrmacht. Stalin is screaming for the Western Allies to open a second front to relieve the pressure. If Britain is knocked out of the war because of a strangled supply line, Hitler no longer has to worry about his western flank. He no longer needs to keep hundreds of thousands of troops guarding the beaches of France against a potential invasion. He no longer needs thousands of 88mm flak guns pointing at the sky to stop bombers flying from England. He can take all of that, every tank, every gun, every soldier, and send them east. Imagine the Battle of Kursk or Stalingrad with an additional 500,000 German troops and uncontested air support. The Soviet Union, resilient as it was, might have broken. Or, perhaps worse, Stalin and Hitler might have negotiated another truce, leaving the Nazis in complete control of Western Europe forever. And what of the map of Europe itself? This is the most chilling what if of all. Even if the Allies eventually defeated Germany, perhaps years later, perhaps using the atomic bomb, the map of 1945 would look radically different. Without the Canadian Navy enabling the buildup in Britain, there is no D-Day in 1944. There is no liberation of France or the Netherlands by Western democracies. If the Nazi regime eventually collapsed, who would fill the vacuum? The Red Army sweeping in from the east. In our timeline, the Iron Curtain fell through the middle of Germany. In a timeline without Canada, that Iron Curtain might have fallen on the coast of the English Channel. All of Europe, from Warsaw to Paris, could have fallen under Soviet control. The democratic, free Western Europe we know today exists because the Allies were able to land in Normandy. They were able to land in Normandy because Britain was a secure base. Britain was a secure base because the Atlantic was open. And the Atlantic was open because of the Royal Canadian Navy. It is a direct line, a chain of cause and effect. Canada didn't just ship wheat. By keeping the Atlantic open, they were shipping the possibility of victory. They were shipping the future of democracy. The Canadian sailors on those freezing corvettes didn't think in these grand geopolitical terms. They were thinking about the ice on the rigging, the next cup of coffee, the ping of the sonar. But history judges them by the result. And the result is clear. When the world balanced on a knife edge, Canada put its thumb on the scale. Without that weight, the scale tips into darkness. So, we have seen the starvation. We have seen the military collapse. We have seen the geopolitical disaster. Now, we must bring it all home. We must answer the question we started with and give credit where it is overdue. We need to end this story not with maps and arrows, but with the human soul of this sacrifice. So, we return to where we started. London, the ration shop, the cold morning mist. The loaf of bread is still there. The fuel is in the tank. The child is drinking her milk. But now, when you look at these simple, everyday things, you see them for what they really are. They are miracles. Each one of them was carried across 3,000 miles of hostile ocean, protected by a thin steel shell made in Canada. We asked a question at the beginning of this journey. Without Canada's RCN and RCAF, how would Britain's civilians starve and its army collapse? The answer is no longer a guess. It is a certainty. Without the Royal Canadian Navy, the screen protecting the convoys would have shattered. The tonnage losses would have exceeded Britain's ability to survive. The ration system would have broken, not in years, but in months. Without the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Black Pit would have remained a slaughterhouse, and the supply of pilots to the RAF would have dried up, leaving the skies open to the Luftwaffe. The civilians would have starved, quite literally, into submission. The army would have collapsed, paralyzed by empty fuel tanks and silent guns. History is often seduced by the glamorous moments. We remember the speeches of Winston Churchill. We remember the landings on D-Day. We remember the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. But wars are not won by speeches. They are won by logistics. They are won by the unglamorous, freezing, terrifying grind of keeping the supply lines open. Canada's role in World War II was not to seek empire or glory. It was to be the linchpin, the essential bolt that held the entire Allied machine together. There is a tragedy in this story, too. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest battle of the Second World War. It started on the first day, and it ended on the last. And the price was paid in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Over 2,000 members of the Royal Canadian Navy gave their lives. Over 700 members of the RCAF died in maritime operations alone. Most of them have no grave but the sea. When a corvette sank, it often vanished in seconds, taking everyone down into the freezing dark. There were no parades for them in the middle of the ocean, just the silence of the waves. They were farmers from Saskatchewan who learned to read sonar. They were clerks from Toronto who learned to chip ice off the rigging of a ship pitching in a hurricane. They were the generation that stepped forward when the world was falling apart. Today, if you walk through the streets of London or Paris or Amsterdam, you are walking in free cities. But that freedom rests on a foundation laid by those rusty Canadian corvettes and those lonely patrol bombers. So the next time you look at a map of World War II, don't just look at the front lines in Europe. Look at the blue space in between. Look at the Atlantic. And remember that in the darkest hour, when the lights were going out all over Europe, there was a lifeline, a pulse, a heartbeat coming from the west. It was the sound of a Canadian ship engine, fighting through the storm, bringing the bread that kept Britain alive, and the steel that liberated a continent. Because without Canada, the history of the 20th century would have been a very different and very dark book to read.